7 years old and she asked me if she was allowed to use the bathroom. Not, can I use the bathroom? Not, I need to go. She stood in the doorway of my kitchen, hands clasped in front of her, and said, "Am I permitted to use the facilities, sir?" I was standing at the stove making grilled cheese. I turned around and looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "Honey, you never have to ask me that. Ever." She nodded very seriously, like she was filing that information away somewhere important. Then she walked down the hall. I stood there holding the spatula, and something cold settled in my chest. My younger brother Conrad and I didn't grow up close. That's the honest answer to the question I know some of you will have. Our parents divorced when I was 9 and he was 5. I went with our mother to Cincinnati. He stayed with our father in Knoxville. We saw each other at holidays, sometimes not even then. By the time we were adults, we were essentially strangers who shared a last name. We talked on the phone maybe 3 times a year. We knew the broad outlines of each other's lives without knowing the details. I knew he'd gotten married young to a woman named Sheila. I knew they'd had a daughter, Aubrey. I knew Sheila had gotten sick, ovarian cancer, and that she'd passed away 4 years ago. Conrad had called me when it happened. It was a hard phone call. I didn't know what to say. I don't think I said the right things. After that, we drifted even further. I sent a card at Christmas. He texted on my birthday. That was about the extent of it. Then, 14 months after Sheila died, he called me to say he'd met someone. A woman named Tracy. He sounded almost apologetic about it, like he was confessing something. I told him that was good, that Sheila would have wanted him to be happy. He said he thought so too. They got married 8 months later. I sent a gift. I didn't attend the wedding. Conrad said it was fine. I told myself it was fine. I'm not proud of the distance between us. I want to be honest about that. I'm not telling you this to make myself look good. I'm telling you because it matters to what happened next, and because I think I owe it to Aubrey to tell the whole truth. I'm 61 years old. I'm retired from the Postal Service. 32 years as a letter carrier, mostly in the same neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. My wife Patricia passed away 6 years ago, a stroke, very sudden. Our kids are grown. My son lives in Portland. My daughter lives about 20 minutes from me, which I'm grateful for every single day. After Patricia, I rattled around in the house for about a year, feeling sorry for myself. Then I cleaned it up, fixed the back porch, started cooking real meals again. I have a routine. I have my garden. I have my neighbor Ted, who comes over on Sundays to watch football and argue about things neither of us knows enough about. I have a life that is quiet and mine. I am not someone who looks for trouble. Conrad called me on a Tuesday evening in March. He was calling from an airport. He had a work trip. He does something in commercial refrigeration, sells equipment to restaurant chains, and it had gotten extended unexpectedly. His wife Tracy had a sister in Asheville with a new baby, and she'd already made plans to go down there that same week, months ago before the work trip came up. Could I take Aubrey for 5 days? I said yes before I really thought about it. She was 7 years old. She was my niece. Of course I said yes. He said he'd drop her off Friday evening. He lived about 50 minutes from me, out past Reynoldsburg. He said she was a good kid. Easy. No trouble at all. I said I'd have the guest room ready. I made up the bed with the yellow quilt Patricia had made, the one with the small flowers. I put a lamp on the nightstand. I bought apple juice and the little goldfish crackers because I didn't know what else a 7-year-old ate, and I was too proud to call and ask. Conrad dropped her off around 6:30. He was in a hurry. He had an early flight. He brought her to the door with a backpack and a small rolling suitcase, hugged her once quickly, told her to be good, and was back in his truck before I'd finished saying goodbye to him. I stood in the doorway and watched his taillights disappear. Then I looked down at Aubrey. She was small for her age. Dark hair in 2 braids. She was wearing a coat that was too thin for March in Ohio. She had both hands on the straps of her backpack and she was looking at me with very careful eyes. "Are you hungry?" I asked. She said, "I don't know." I thought that was an odd answer. I said, "Well, I've got leftover chicken soup. How does that sound?" She said, "That sounds nice, sir." I told her she didn't have to call me sir. She could call me Uncle Neil. She nodded like she was memorizing that too. We got through Friday night fine. She ate the soup, one bowl, and asked very politely if she could be excused. She carried her bowl to the sink without being asked. She said goodnight at 8 o'clock and went to bed. I heard her close the door quietly. Saturday morning was when things started to shift. I made pancakes. I do this every Saturday. It's the one thing I cook that actually turns out well. I made a full stack, set the table, called her down. She came downstairs already dressed, hair brushed, backpack on. I told her she could leave the backpack. She wasn't going anywhere. She took it off slowly, like she wasn't sure about that decision, and set it beside her chair. I put 2 pancakes on her plate. She looked at them. Then she looked up at me. Then she said, "Am I allowed to have more if I eat these?" Something about the way she phrased it stopped me. Not, "Can I have more?" Not, "Will there be more?" "Am I allowed?" Like permission was the variable. Like the food was contingent on something I hadn't explained yet. I put the whole plate of pancakes on the table and sat down across from her. "This is your house for the week," I said. "You eat as much as you want. You don't ask me. You just eat." She stared at the plate of pancakes. Then her face crumpled and she started crying. Not loudly. That almost made it worse. She cried the way you cry when you've had a lot of practice doing it quietly. Shoulders curved in, head down. Tears just falling. No noise. Like she'd learned not to make noise when she cried. I didn't say anything for a moment because I didn't trust myself to say the right thing. I got up and put my hand on her shoulder and said, "Hey, it's okay. You're okay." She cried for about 2 more minutes. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, sat up straight, and said, "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," I said. "Eat your pancakes." She ate 4 of them. I didn't say anything else about it that morning. I didn't want to push. But I started watching. I noticed she drank her orange juice in small measured sips like she was rationing it. I noticed she asked before she took anything from the refrigerator, even a bottle of water. I noticed that when I offered her a snack in the afternoon, just crackers and peanut butter, nothing special, she took exactly 3 crackers and ate them slowly. I noticed that when she came downstairs Sunday morning, she was wearing the same clothes she'd worn Saturday. That afternoon, she was in the guest room, and I knocked on the door to tell her we were going to the grocery store. She said she'd be ready in a minute. When I pushed the door open, she was kneeling next to the bed, and she quickly stood up. I'm 61 years old. My knees are bad, but I got down on one knee and looked under that bed. There was a paper bag from the grocery store. Inside it, a banana, a package of peanut butter crackers still in the wrapper, a dinner roll, and a small bag of baby carrots. I recognized the banana and the dinner roll. They were from the meal I'd made Friday night. I sat on the edge of the bed. Aubrey stood by the window watching me. "Can you tell me about this?" I said. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "It's for later." "For later when?" She didn't answer. I asked her as gently as I knew how, if there were times at home when she didn't have food. She said, "Sometimes I don't do enough boxes." It took me the rest of that afternoon to understand what boxes meant. She explained it to me the way a child explains something they believe is normal. Very matter of fact. There was a chart on the refrigerator at home. Each day had 6 boxes. You got a box checked for making your bed, a box for keeping your room tidy, a box for finishing homework, a box for not talking back, a box for completing your assigned chores, and a box for what she called minding Tracy. 5 out of 6 boxes meant you got all 3 meals. 4 boxes meant no dessert and a smaller dinner. 3 boxes meant no lunch. 2 boxes or fewer meant no dinner. She said this like she was explaining the rules of a board game. "Who made this chart?" I asked. "Tracy," she said. "Daddy said it builds character." I asked her how often she got fewer than 5 boxes. She looked at the window. She said, "It depends on the week." I asked her what happened when she was hungry at night. "I'm not supposed to go in the kitchen after 8, she said. "But sometimes I sneak crackers and put them in my bag." "Tracy checks my room sometimes, but she doesn't check the bag." I said, "Does your teacher know about this?" She shook her head. Then she said, "We're not supposed to talk about home things." I told her we were going to the grocery store and I was going to buy everything she wanted. I told her we were going to come home and make a big dinner and she could have as much as she wanted of everything. She said, "Are you going to tell my dad?" I said, "Yes." She nodded. She didn't look surprised. I called my daughter that evening after Aubrey went to bed. My daughter is 34. She's a nurse. She's the clearest-headed person I know. I told her everything. She was quiet through most of it. At the end she said, "Dad, this is neglect. This is documented child neglect. You need to call CPS before you call Conrad." I said I wanted to talk to Conrad first. She said, "I know you do. But if you tip him off, he has time to get rid of the chart. Get Aubrey to say different things. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I sat in my kitchen for a long time after we hung up. I thought about the paper bag under the bed. I thought about Aubrey counting crackers. I thought about a 7-year-old girl who cried silently because someone put a plate of food in front of her. Then I called the Franklin County Children's Services hotline. The caseworker who came to my house the next morning was a woman named Donna. She was matter-of-fact and thorough, and she treated Aubrey with a gentleness that I was grateful for. She spoke with Aubrey privately for about 40 minutes in the living room while I waited in the kitchen. Afterward, she came and sat at my kitchen table and wrote things down without telling me what Aubrey had said. She asked me questions. She photographed the contents of the paper bag, which I'd left untouched. She asked me if I had any knowledge of the chart Aubrey had described. I said no, but I intended to find out. Donna told me that a caseworker would be visiting Conrad's home. She told me I should not contact Conrad before that visit. She also asked me something I hadn't expected. She asked me whether I knew if Aubrey had a trust or any financial accounts in her name. I said I didn't know. She wrote something down. After Donna left, I thought about why she'd asked that question. Sheila's family had money. I knew that vaguely. They owned a chain of dry cleaning businesses in East Tennessee. I knew Sheila had a life insurance policy because Conrad had mentioned it once when Aubrey was born. He'd said he wanted to make sure she was covered. I called Sheila's mother. I had the number in an old address book because we'd exchanged cards after the funeral and I'd never deleted it. Her name is Mrs. Tanner and I had met her exactly twice, at the funeral and at a Christmas gathering 4 or 5 years before that. She picked up on the third ring. I told her who I was. I told her about the week. I told her what Aubrey had told me about the chart, the boxes, the missing meals. There was a very long silence on the other end of the phone. Then Mrs. Tanner said, "I've been worried for months. I asked to see that child, and there's always a reason it doesn't work out." She said she'd been told Aubrey was adjusting, that she was shy around the grandmother now, that it wasn't good for her to have too many disruptions. She said she'd believed it because she wanted to believe it. I asked her about the trust. Another silence. Then she said, Sheila had a $250,000 life insurance policy. It named Aubrey as beneficiary. There was also a savings account with about $40,000 in it. When Sheila died, her attorney set it up so that Conrad would be custodian of those funds until Aubrey turned 21. Everything was supposed to go toward her education and well-being. I asked when the attorney had last reviewed the accounts. "Mrs. Quelt," Tanner said, "that's what I've been trying to find out." She'd hired her own attorney 6 weeks ago, she told me. He'd sent a letter requesting an accounting of the trust funds. Conrad had not responded. I told her I thought she should call Donna at Franklin County Children's Services. She said she'd already pulled up the number before I finished the sentence. I want to be honest about what the next 2 weeks were like. Conrad called me the night the caseworker visited his home. He was furious. He said Aubrey was manipulative, that she'd gotten dramatic ideas from television, that the chart was a standard behavioral system that her pediatrician had helped design. He said Tracy was a good woman who was doing her best with a difficult child. He said I had overreacted and that I had no idea what it was like to raise a kid alone. I let him talk. When he finished, I said, "Conrad, her pediatrician's name is on her insurance card and that card is in the front pocket of her backpack. I will call that office tomorrow morning. If they confirm they designed this system, I will apologize to you and to Tracy both, in writing, whatever you want." He hung up. I called the pediatrician's office the next morning. I explained who I was and asked whether they had any record of designing or recommending a behavioral chart that included food restriction as a consequence. The nurse who answered put me on hold for 4 minutes. Then a doctor got on the line. He said, "Sir, I can assure you that no physician in this practice has ever recommended withholding food from a child as a disciplinary measure. That would be against every standard of care we follow." He asked me for my name and number. He said he wanted to make a note of the call. The case moved faster than I expected once it moved. The financial piece was what accelerated things. Mrs. Tanner's attorney had gotten a court order for a full accounting of Aubrey's trust. What they found was that in the 2 years since Conrad had married Tracy, approximately $68,000 had been withdrawn from Aubrey's education fund. The stated reason on the withdrawal documents was extraordinary care expenses. There were no receipts. There was no documentation. The money had moved to a joint checking account belonging to Conrad and Tracy. Conrad's attorney argued that the withdrawals were legitimate, that raising a child was expensive, that the custodianship agreement gave him discretion. Mrs. Doubt, Tanner's attorney, argued that buying a child a used coat while spending $68,000 of her dead mother's money was not discretion, it was theft. I testified at the family court hearing in June. I described what I had found. I described the conversation about the boxes. I described the paper bag under the bed. I described the way Aubrey asked if she was allowed to have more. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had the kind of face that didn't give anything away, asked Conrad at one point where he had learned that food restriction was an appropriate disciplinary tool. Conrad said he'd read about it online, that it was a natural consequences approach. The judge said, "Feeding a child is not a reward, it is a baseline responsibility. This is not a complicated distinction." She ruled that Aubrey would be placed with Mrs. Tanner while the financial investigation continued. She ordered a full forensic accounting of all custodial accounts. She mandated that Conrad and Tracy complete a parenting course and individual counseling before any reunification could be considered. She froze all remaining funds in Aubrey's trust pending the financial review. She did not rule on permanent custody that day. She said that would come later pending the investigation. That was 4 months ago. Aubrey has been living with Mrs. Tanner in Knoxville. I drove down to visit in August. Mrs. Tanner has a big old house with a yard that backs up to a creek. Aubrey was brown from the sun. She was louder than I'd ever heard her. She was sitting in the grass pulling apart a dandelion when I pulled up, and she ran across the yard when she saw me and hugged me around the waist so hard I almost lost my balance. We made grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch, her and me together. She stood on a step stool next to the stove, and I showed her how to press the spatula down so the cheese melts all the way. She ate 2.5 sandwiches and talked the entire time about her new school and a girl named Kelsey who had a dog, and whether I thought Mrs. Banches, Tanner, would let her get a hamster. She did not ask if she was allowed to have more. She just took the other half and ate it. I've thought a lot about the years I wasn't paying attention. About how easy it is to tell yourself that no news is good news, that if something were really wrong, you'd hear about it. That people are handling their own lives, and you don't need to insert yourself. I was wrong about that. A child doesn't broadcast that she's hungry. She learns to be quiet about it. She learns to save crackers in a paper bag and hide them under a mattress, and act like that is normal. Because to her it has become normal. She asks permission to use the bathroom. She cries silently when someone puts a full plate in front of her because she has learned that food comes with conditions, and she is still waiting to find out what the conditions are. You don't see it unless you're looking, and you don't look unless you're there. Conrad and I have not spoken since the hearing. I don't know what happens next with him. I don't know what I feel about him. Some days I'm angry. Some days I just feel like I failed at being a brother for most of his life. And I'm not sure what that would have changed, but I think about it. What I know is this. Aubrey is 7 years old, and she is at a house with a yard that backs up to a creek, and she runs across the grass, and she eats grilled cheese, and she doesn't ask permission. That's enough for right now. That has to be enough. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot since all of this happened. Not in a grand philosophical way, just in the plain, practical way you think about things when you're 61 and you've got enough years behind you to see how one decision pulls a thread that unravels something 10 years later. Or, in some cases, how one moment of actually paying attention can stop the unraveling before it goes too far. Conrad made choices. Small ones at first, probably. He chose distance after his first wife died. He chose speed, getting remarried before the grief had any room to settle. He chose convenience over scrutiny, telling himself Tracy was good enough because he needed her to be good enough, because being a single father at his age with his travel schedule was something he couldn't sustain. And then, somewhere in all of that choosing, he chose to stop looking closely at his own daughter. He let a chart on a refrigerator become the substitute for actual parenting, and he called it character building because that was easier than calling it what it was. I'm not saying this to condemn him. I spent decades not looking closely either. I chose distance the same way he did, just from farther away. I told myself that no news was good news. I sent Christmas cards and considered my obligation met. That's its own kind of failure. What I keep coming back to is Aubrey, 7 years old, hiding crackers in a paper bag, not crying loudly. Just crying quietly, because she had already learned that loud crying didn't get her anywhere. That right there is what happens when a child lives too long without feeling safe. The noise stops. They go internal. They start rationing food, emotions, requests. They learn to manage their own hunger rather than expect anyone to feed them. A child is not supposed to learn that lesson at 7. The thing about moral choices is that they compound. Conrad's small negligences stacked up over 2 years into something a judge had to sort out in a courtroom. Tracy's chart was a small thing, a piece of paper on a refrigerator, but it represented a decision made every single day to treat a grieving child's access to food as a bargaining chip. You don't arrive at $68,000 stolen from a dead woman's daughter all at once. You arrive there one withdrawal at a time, each one feeling justifiable. Until one day someone asks for receipts and there aren't any. On my end, the only thing I did that mattered was stay in the room long enough to notice. That's the full extent of my heroism, if you can even call it that. I made pancakes. I watched a little girl count crackers. I got down on one bad knee and looked under a bed. Then I made a phone call I should have been willing to make years earlier, when I still had the chance to be a real brother to Conrad, to know him well enough to see this coming. I think about what I would tell someone going through something like this. Not a speech, just the plain version. Pay attention to the children in your life, not the general idea of them, the actual ones. Watch how they eat. Watch whether they asked permission for things they shouldn't need permission for. Watch whether they cry quietly or loudly. The loud ones are hard. The quiet ones are the ones who've stopped expecting anything. And if you see a paper bag under a bed, look inside it. That's the whole lesson. The rest is just details.